To speak of Frida Kahlo is to invoke a figure who exists at the crossroads of art, myth, and revolution, a woman whose life was as vividly painted as her canvases. She has been called a surrealist, a folk artist, a feminist icon, a martyr of pain, and a prophet of authenticity. Yet none of these categories capture her completely. Kahlo resists containment. She is at once the fragile child stricken by polio, the young woman impaled by a streetcar's iron rail, the dazzling wife of Diego Rivera, the ardent communist, and the self-styled goddess who adorned her broken body with Tewana dresses and crowns of flowers. Her paintings are intimate altarpieces where anatomy, folklore, and politics collide, works that stare back at the viewer with eyes unflinching in their honesty. She lived in a Mexico emerging from revolution, a nation forging its modern identity from indigenous roots and socialist dreams, and she placed herself directly at the center of that turbulent cultural rebirth. To study Frida Kahlo is not merely to admire brushstrokes, but to enter into a life where biography and art are inseparable, each wound converted into symbol, each love affair painted as allegory, each act of survival recast as defiance. Her story is thrilling because it defies the logic of tragedy. Pain did not silence her, but became her palette. Betrayal did not destroy her, but sharpened her gaze. Politics did not eclipse her individuality, but expanded her stage. Kahlo stands as both subject and object of her art, simultaneously muse and master, a mirror of Mexico's fractured yet fertile modernity. Any exploration of her world must be multifaceted, weaving together the intimate with the ideological, the physical with the symbolic, the historical with the personal. This is not simply the story of an artist, but the chronicle of a woman who turned her suffering into revolution, her body into a canvas, and her life into one of the most compelling narratives of the 20th century. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the district of Coyoacán, then a quiet suburb of Mexico City, into a family background marked by both cultural richness and personal hardship. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German-born photographer of Hungarian Jewish descent, and her mother, Matilda Calderón y González, was of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage. This bicultural environment shaped Frida's worldview from an early age, instilling in her an awareness of duality, of European and Mexican traditions, of the modern and the ancient, that would later infuse her art with a sense of layered complexity. Kahlo was the third of 4 daughters, and while she grew up surrounded by siblings, her early years were marked by illness, isolation, and introspection. At the age of 6, she contracted polio, a disease that left her with a lifelong limp and a right leg that was visibly thinner than her left. This physical difference exposed her to teasing and bullying from other children, but it also fostered in her a strong will, a sense of individuality, and the resilience to face suffering with defiance. Even as a child, Frida demonstrated sharp intelligence, rebellious wit, and a drive to distinguish herself beyond the limitations imposed by her gender and health. She cultivated a passion for reading, literature, and philosophy, imagining worlds of possibility beyond her immediate surroundings. Kahlo would later reconstruct her childhood identity with deliberate myth-making, claiming to have been born in 1910, the year the Mexican Revolution began, so that her life would symbolically coincide with the rebirth of her nation. This conscious act of self-fashioning illustrates her early tendency to blend personal biography with historical narrative, a characteristic that would become central to her mature artistic voice. The turning point in Frida Kahlo's adolescence came on September 17, 1925, when the bus she was riding collided with a streetcar, leaving her body shattered by multiple fractures, dislocations, and internal injuries. Among the most devastating wounds was a metal handrail that pierced her abdomen and pelvis, an injury that left her in excruciating pain and compromised her reproductive capacity for the rest of her life. The accident became the defining physical catastrophe of her biography, forcing her into prolonged periods of immobility and subjecting her to more than 30 medical operations over the course of her lifetime. During her recovery, immobilized in a full-body plaster cast, Kahlo began to paint in earnest, using a specially designed easel that allowed her to work from her bed. Her mother provided her with brushes, paints, and a mirror fixed to the underside of her canopy, enabling her to confront herself directly and begin the lifelong project of self-portraiture. "I paint myself because I am so often alone," she would later explain, underscoring how solitude and physical confinement compelled her to make her body and psyche the primary subjects of her work. These early self-portraits were not simply exercises in likeness, but efforts to make sense of pain, mortality, and identity in visual form. In the crucible of suffering, Kahlo discovered the therapeutic and existential power of art, a discovery that elevated her from a convalescent teenager to a budding artist with an urgent need to give shape to her inner reality. Her canvases became mirrors not of vanity, but of survival. Kahlo's family played an essential role in supporting her during these early years of recovery, yet her relationship with them was layered with complexities. Guillermo Kahlo, despite his own fragile health due to epilepsy, provided not only emotional support, but also a model of disciplined creativity through his photography, which demanded patience, precision, and a sensitivity to visual composition. These qualities were absorbed by Frida and later became part of her painterly approach. Her mother, by contrast, was more ambivalent and less emotionally available, though she helped design the bed easel that enabled her daughter to paint. The household environment oscillated between care and tension, shaping Frida's psychological landscape as much as her artistic sensibility. Despite financial limitations, Guillermo encouraged his daughter's intellectual development, exposing her to European culture through books and conversations. Frida, however, rooted herself equally in the vibrant world of Mexican folk traditions, fascinated by talismans, religious icons, and colorful artifacts that decorated her home. These contrasting influences, photographic modernity on one hand and indigenous symbolism on the other, would merge in her mature work to create an iconography that was uniquely hers. Family dynamics also played into her notions of gender roles and maternal ambivalence, themes she would later explore in paintings such as My Birth, 1932. Kahlo's relationship with her parents encapsulated the contradictions of protection and neglect, love and estrangement, modernity and tradition. These tensions seeded the emotional depth and visual dichotomies that came to characterize her work, making the domestic sphere an early theater of both suffering and creative awakening. When Kahlo entered the National Preparatory School in 1922, she stepped into a crucible of cultural experimentation and political ferment that would sharpen her intellectual and artistic sensibilities. Among her classmates were future luminaries of Mexican politics and culture, and it was here that she first encountered Diego Rivera, who was painting a mural in the school's auditorium. At this stage, their relationship was distant, yet Rivera's commanding presence as an artist left a lasting impression on her. Frida herself quickly stood out among the approximately 35 girls admitted to the institution, where a predominantly male environment forced her to assert her intelligence and wit. She became part of a group of intellectual mischief makers known as the Cachuchas, who challenged authority and engaged in lively debates on literature, philosophy, and politics. Through these associations, Kahlo absorbed revolutionary ideas, Marxist theory, and a vision of culture as an instrument of social transformation. This exposure dovetailed with her growing admiration for Mexico's indigenous roots, which she studied alongside her peers as they embraced nationalism in the wake of revolution. Although Kahlo's initial ambition at the school was to pursue medicine, her intellectual formation there provided the ideological framework that later infused her art with political depth. The camaraderie, irreverence, and radicalism of the preparatory school environment cultivated in her a sensibility that rejected conformity, questioned authority, and sought authenticity. These qualities became hallmarks of her persona as much as of her art. Kahlo's early experiments with painting reveal both her technical aptitude and her thematic preoccupations. The works she produced during convalescence, portraits of friends, family, and herself, bear the imprint of European traditions, particularly Renaissance portraiture, with their focus on frontal composition and detailed backgrounds. Yet even in these formative attempts, her unique sensibility was evident. She inserted symbols and personal references that transcended mere likeness. Unlike many of her contemporaries, who viewed painting as an external representation, Kahlo treated the canvas as a psychological and emotional stage. Her brushwork combined precision with intimacy, drawing on the clarity of photographic composition while resisting mechanical detachment. The result was imagery charged with subjectivity, where objects, animals, and settings conveyed layers of allegorical meaning. For example, in early self-portraits, she surrounded herself with elements like plants, jewelry, or costumes that referenced both personal identity and broader cultural affiliations. These early efforts anticipated the fusion of realism and symbolism that would later define her mature style. Moreover, her decision to focus so heavily on her own image was itself an act of defiance against the invisibility often imposed on women. By placing herself at the center of the canvas, Kahlo asserted her right to narrate her experience from within, rejecting the external gaze as the sole arbiter of representation. Thus, her earliest works can be seen as laboratories of identity, where pain, heritage, and self-consciousness converged in visual form. By the late 1920s, Kahlo's growing confidence as a painter was matched by her increasing involvement in Mexico's post-revolutionary cultural revival, which celebrated faux traditions, indigenous heritage, and political radicalism. This revival, often termed the Mexican Renaissance, was championed by artists such as Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, whose monumental murals sought to craft a new national identity rooted in social justice and collective memory. Although Kahlo did not work on murals herself, she absorbed the ethos of this movement and reinterpreted it through the lens of intimate, small-scale painting. Her works contrasted with the vast public canvases of her contemporaries by focusing instead on the private and the personal, yet they were no less political in their resonance. Through the incorporation of pre-Columbian imagery, traditional Mexican dress, and folkloric motifs, Kahlo aligned herself with the indigenismo movement, which valorized the cultural contributions of Mexico's native peoples. Her choice to wear Tehuana dresses, for instance, was both a personal embrace of tradition and a symbolic act of resistance against colonial and bourgeois aesthetics. In this period, her art began to move beyond private therapy and toward cultural commentary, making her an active participant in the forging of a modern Mexican identity. The convergence of personal pain with nationalist symbolism laid the foundation for a style that was deeply idiosyncratic yet inseparable from its historical moment. The trajectory of Kahlo's formative years culminated in her meeting and eventual deepening relationship with Diego Rivera, whose larger-than-life persona contrasted starkly with her own fragile physicality but complemented her intellectual boldness. Rivera, already an established artist of international renown, recognized in Kahlo not only a gifted painter but also a fiercely independent spirit. Their union, formalized in marriage in 1929, was a decisive moment in her life, intertwining her destiny with that of a man who would become both her greatest supporter and her most turbulent challenge. The relationship was marked from the outset by contradictions. Kahlo admired Rivera's political commitment, artistic genius, and charisma, but she was also wary of his egotism and notorious infidelity. This dynamic of attraction and conflict became one of the central dramas of her personal and artistic life. Through Rivera, Kahlo was introduced to a wider artistic and political circle that included intellectuals, communists, and expatriates, expanding her horizons beyond the insular world of convalescence and family. Yet, even as she entered Rivera's orbit, she maintained her distinctive voice, refusing to become a mere satellite of his career. The marriage cemented her position within Mexico's cultural avant-garde, but it also inaugurated years of emotional turbulence that would repeatedly find expression in her paintings. By the end of the 1920s, Kahlo had thus laid the foundation of her identity as an artist, forged in pain, sharpened by intellect, enriched by culture, and soon to be tested by love and politics. The trajectory of Kahlo's formative years culminated in her meeting and eventual deepening relationship with Diego Rivera, whose larger-than-life persona contrasted starkly with her own fragile physicality but complemented her intellectual boldness. Rivera, already an established artist of international renown, recognized in Kahlo not only a gifted painter but also a fiercely independent spirit. Their union, formalized in marriage in 1929, was a decisive moment in her life, intertwining her destiny with that of a man who would become both her greatest supporter and her most turbulent challenge. The relationship was marked from the outset by contradictions. Kahlo admired Rivera's political commitment, artistic genius, and charisma, but she was also wary of his egotism and notorious infidelity. This dynamic of attraction and conflict became one of the central dramas of her personal and artistic life. Through Rivera, Kahlo was introduced to a wider artistic and political circle that included intellectuals, communists, and expatriates, expanding her horizons beyond the insular world of convalescence and family. Yet, even as she entered Rivera's orbit, she maintained her distinctive voice, refusing to become a mere satellite of his career. The marriage cemented her position within Mexico's cultural avant-garde, but it also inaugurated years of emotional turbulence that would repeatedly find expression in her paintings. By the end of the 1920s, Kahlo had thus laid the foundation of her identity as an artist, forged in pain, sharpened by intellect, enriched by culture, and soon to be tested by love and politics. Frida Kahlo's artistic style emerged from a fusion of tradition, personal experience, and radical experimentation, producing a body of work that resists neat classification yet resonates with unparalleled intimacy. Though often associated with surrealism, Kahlo herself rejected the label, declaring that she never painted dreams but her own reality. This insistence reflects her distinctive vision. Her paintings are not escapist fantasies, but meticulously crafted depictions of lived experience, charged with symbolism drawn from her physical body, emotional wounds, and cultural surroundings. Unlike the European surrealists, who turned inward to explore subconscious associations, Kahlo's images were rooted in material reality, from her accident-induced pain to her miscarriages, turbulent marriage, and nationalist commitments. Her canvases were typically small in scale, almost portable, yet their intensity rendered them monumental in psychological impact. Each work is constructed as a visual autobiography, layered with symbols that blend personal detail with universal themes of love, loss, resilience, and identity. Critics have noted her remarkable ability to compress complex narratives into singular images, making her works simultaneously accessible and enigmatic. This ambiguity is key to their enduring power. Viewers are drawn by the arresting frontal gaze, then unsettled by the strange juxtapositions of plants, animals, anatomical organs, and cultural icons. In doing so, Kahlo elevated self-portraiture to a form of political testimony, with a private body stood in for broader struggles, and the intimate became inseparable from the collective. She was less a surrealist than a realist of the soul, and her visual language was one of confrontation rather than escape. One of the earliest works that exemplifies Kahlo's symbolic approach is Henry Ford Hospital, 1932, a painting created after a devastating miscarriage in Detroit. In this canvas, Kahlo lies naked on a hospital bed, her small figure dwarfed by a barren industrial landscape, with 6 umbilical cords attaching her body to floating objects: a fetus, a pelvic bone, a model of a uterus, a snail, a mechanical device, and an orchid. Each object symbolizes aspects of loss, reproduction, and fragility, with the fetus representing the child she could not carry, the pelvic bone alluding to her injuries from the bus accident, and the snail perhaps suggesting the slow, agonizing passage of time. The stark juxtaposition of her frail body against the machinery of modern industry situates her personal tragedy within a broader critique of industrial modernity, exposing its alienation and dehumanization. Kahlo is neither idealized nor concealed. She is painfully exposed, her body rendered vulnerable yet dignified in its honesty. The painting shocked viewers for its rawness and unflinching confrontation with taboo subjects such as miscarriage, female anatomy, and medical trauma. At a time when women's reproductive experiences were shrouded in silence, Kahlo placed her suffering at the center of the canvas, demanding recognition. This willingness to foreground personal pain as a public subject became one of her defining contributions to 20th century art. In Henry Ford Hospital, Kahlo created a visual manifesto of corporeal truth, challenging both artistic convention and social decorum, and solidifying her reputation as an artist unafraid to confront life's harshest realities head-on. Perhaps Kahlo's most famous double portrait, the Two Fridas, 1939, demonstrates her ability to render inner conflict in strikingly visual terms. Painted during her separation from Rivera, the canvas depicts two versions of herself seated side by side, holding hands yet exposing contrasting identities. The Frida on the left wears European dress and holds scissors cutting an exposed vein from her heart, symbolizing rejection and vulnerability, while the Frida on the right, dressed in traditional Tijuana attire, clutches a small portrait of Rivera and displays a heart intact, though equally exposed. The two figures are connected by veins and blood, suggesting both solidarity and fracture, unity and rupture. Through this stark juxtaposition, Kahlo dramatizes the tension between her cosmopolitan and traditional selves, between abandonment and strength, between external rejection and inner survival. The symmetry of the composition and the open display of hearts lend the painting an almost surgical clarity, as if Kahlo were dissecting her emotional state with scientific precision. Yet the symbolism transcends autobiography, speaking to larger issues of cultural hybridity and fractured identity in post-revolutionary Mexico. In a society negotiating between European modernity and indigenous tradition, Kahlo's two selves became allegorical figures of national identity as well as personal anguish. The painting thus operates on multiple registers simultaneously, a confession of heartbreak, a meditation on duality, and a cultural commentary. With the Two Fridas, Kahlo achieved one of her most iconic visual formulations of the paradoxes that defined her life and art. Paradoxes of union and separation, strength and vulnerability, rootedness and cosmopolitanism. Another striking example of Kahlo's symbolic visual language can be found in Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, 1940, where she presents herself frontally, gazing directly at the viewer, a necklace of thorns digging in her neck as drops of blood fall. A dead hummingbird hangs like a pendant at her chest, while black panthers and monkeys surround her amidst lush foliage. This juxtaposition of pain, death, and vitality underscores Kahlo's ability to merge Catholic martyr imagery with Mexican folklore, producing a complex allegory of suffering and resistance. The thorn necklace evokes the crown of thorns worn by Christ, positioning Kahlo as both victim and saint, while the dead hummingbird, often a symbol of luck or love in Mexican tradition, suggests thwarted desire and fatal loss. The animals that frame her, monkey, cat, butterflies, add layers of meaning, oscillating between playfulness, danger, and transformation. The direct gaze challenges the viewer, transforming the painting into a confrontation as much as a depiction. Unlike traditional portraits that flatter or conceal, Kahlo's rendering insists on an unvarnished confrontation with pain, beauty, and survival. This painting exemplifies her capacity to synthesize visual traditions, Christian iconography, indigenous symbolism, personal suffering, into images of universal resonance. Its compact scale intensifies its intimacy, demanding the viewer's close attention while rewarding it with dense, multivalent symbolism. Through such works, Kahlo forged a style that was deeply personal yet culturally expansive, grounding her self-image within a visual world that bridged past and present, folklore and modernity, life and death. Kahlo's symbolic vocabulary consistently fused personal suffering with broader cultural references, making her paintings both autobiographical and universal. Her repeated inclusion of indigenous dress, pre-Columbian artifacts, and folkloric motifs was not only a reflection of her heritage, but also an assertion of cultural pride in a post-revolutionary Mexico that sought to redefine itself. For instance, in her self-portraits wearing Tehuana costumes, Kahlo projected herself as a modern yet rooted Mexican woman, simultaneously personalizing and politicizing her image. These elements aligned her work with the indigenismo movement, which celebrated native traditions as essential to the national identity. Yet Kahlo's use of these motifs was never merely decorative. They were infused with symbolic meanings that extended from her own experiences to larger struggles for cultural affirmation. The flowers in her hair, the animals she cradled, the jewelry she wore, each detail carried layers of historical and political resonance. At the same time, Kahlo complicated nationalist narratives by inserting her own vulnerability and physical suffering into the imagery, thereby questioning the cost of identity construction. Her work thus transcended both personal confession and national propaganda, existing in the dynamic space between them. This fusion of the intimate and the political endowed her paintings with unusual force. They could be read as private diaries and as public manifestos simultaneously. In asserting her personal presence so vividly, Kahlo transformed herself into both subject and symbol of Mexico's modernity, making her art a unique site where biography and ideology converged. In addition to symbolism, Kahlo's technical methods deserve close analysis, for they reveal how her style diverged from the monumentalism of her contemporaries. While Rivera and the muralists painted massive frescoes with sweeping political narratives, Kahlo chose the small scale of panel paintings, often executed on masonite or metal, a format reminiscent of Mexican ex voto devotional art. These intimate works were designed not for grand public spaces, but for personal contemplation, demanding close and careful viewing. Kahlo exploited this scale to create paintings that function like visual reliquaries, inviting the viewer into her world of suffering and resilience. Her brushwork, though precise and meticulous, was never detached. It conveyed the tactile immediacy of lived experience, as if each line traced a scar, each color bled from memory. The precision of her line owes much to her father's photographic sensibility, yet she imbued it with emotional charge absent from photography's mechanical eye. This blend of technical rigor and emotive power gave her works a tension between control and eruption, order and chaos. Furthermore, her use of framing devices, backgrounds, and objects demonstrated a compositional intelligence that belied the notion of her as a naive or folk painter. Instead, Kahlo was a deliberate and technically adept artist, whose choice of scale, medium, and detail was as meaningful as her symbolism. In this sense, her style represented a conscious departure from both European modernism and Mexican muralism, positioning her as a singular figure in 20th century art. Taken together, Kahlo's stylistic hallmarks, frontal self-portraiture, symbolic layering, and the blending of personal trauma with cultural allegory, position her as one of the most original voices of the 20th century. Her paintings resist the notion of art as detached aesthetic object and instead function as visceral encounters with the human condition. Viewers are confronted not merely with Kahlo's likeness, but with her wounds, her political beliefs, her heritage, and her enduring defiance. In this sense, her art anticipates later feminist and post-colonial movements that would use the body as a site of resistance and the canvas as a space of testimony. She created images that were as much about collective identity as individual expression, collapsing the boundary between self and society, private pain and public discourse. Critics have long debated whether her art should be read primarily as autobiography, political statement, or cultural allegory, but its enduring significance lies precisely in its refusal to settle into a single category. Instead, her work embodies multiplicity, insisting on complexity, contradiction, and hybridity. Kahlo's paintings are never passive. They demand confrontation, engagement, and recognition of the realities she endured. Through them, she transformed suffering into narrative, wounds into symbols, and her own fractured body into a universal text. By synthesizing technical precision, symbolic density, and autobiographical honesty, Kahlo created a legacy that extends beyond the canvas into the realms of politics, culture, and identity. In the face of despair, she painted resilience. In the face of invisibility, she painted herself unforgettably.